Susie Larson here. Thank you for joining me for this session of Facebook Live. I've done a number of these in the past. I hope to do more in the future with this format, an interview format. And for those of you who've listened to my show, Live the Promise, you know that we have a favorite guest that we would have on once a month. His name is Dr. Troy, and he has lots of fans. There he is, Dr. Troy. And I want to tell you just how he and I connected. If you've read any of my stuff, you've heard me speak or listened to the show, you know that I've dealt with some chronic health issues most of my adult life, but I also have a background in fitness. So I'm very passionate about the stewardship of our health. Well, I would say about 2.5 years ago, a friend told me, because of all the flare-up issues I was having, neurological problems, a friend told me, you've got to go see my doctor. And the rest was history. I had this total passion for health. I'm a woman who loves God, and I'm a person who had health issues. And never before had I met someone who brought these together in the most profound way, where I started to understand on a deeper level that there are physiological implications to our discouragement, to our fear. And though health issues may spur up fears and anxieties, we need to steward our response to our health. And there are so many things we put up with and we live with that we don't need to, that there are choices we can make to contribute to our health. So as I said, I'm hoping to do this. In fact, Dr. Troy and I have talked about doing it once a month so we can take your questions. I want to know where you're watching from, so just chime in that way. I'm going to give Dr. Troy a proper introduction in a moment. Also want you to know we'll be giving away 5 copies of this book, In Over Your Head. It's a book that I wrote years ago that recently re-released, and it's on physical and spiritual health. And I'll explain how you can get a copy in a little while later in the broadcast. But Dr. Troy is the founder, CEO of Synapse Center for Health and Healing in Eagan, Minnesota. I never in my life have met someone more committed to seeing the multitudes well. He is passionate about it. He's a man of faith, and he's my doctor, but he's become an amazing friend to our family. So Dr. Troy, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
So good to be back together again, right? Yeah, we're getting the band back together. So
that's right.
I'm not a doctor, but I played one on radio. So
absolutely.
Chime in whenever. But as we did on Live the Promise, just for fun, we always started, well, this was more than just for fun. We did it because we love God's word. But for fun tonight, I would love if you would maybe come and share a verse with us before we get the conversation going.
Yes, absolutely. This is Matthew 11:28. And there's a lot of meaning here, because when I say this, when I read it, especially the last half of it is very meaningful as far as me talking to patients, but also in my personal walk, it's become very, very true. And so we could dive into just this verse for the entire hour, but I know we've got other things to do, but this is one of my favorites. So Matthew 11:28, get away with me and you'll recover life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. And there's so much in that, just because of what it looks like, because there's more than just reading scripture in the morning. He says, walk with me. That's an action step. There's stuff that you do on a daily basis. Work with me implies that it's not just done. There's a process involved. And watch how I do it. I am always in awe how God solves my problems, how God helps me in my life. It's just complete awe. And now I'm at a point where I've seen it enough where my question that pops in my brain is, well, what's this one going to look like? Yeah. How are you going to do it this time, God? This is a real tricky one.
Well, you always say if you're not getting answers, ask a better question. But
absolutely.
You very much rely on the wisdom of the Holy Spirit in your life and seeking God for answers. And, I remember when I was sick, and I told you this story years ago, I was begging God to heal me because I was it gets old to feel sick and tired all the time. And I said, oh God, would you heal me? And the Lord whispered back to me, I would heal you today, but you would lose it tomorrow. And I thought, why would that be? And Lord whispered back to my heart again, because you think like a sick person. You don't have the infrastructure for health and healing. And the truth is the Lyme disease symptoms were so horrifying and so scary. They just stirred up more fear. And I've heard this is the case with cancer patients as well, is once you've been through the battle, the symptoms come and you kind of brace, and pretty soon you're reading into every little ache and pain, and you become a fear reactor. And I had to spend the last 20 years renewing my mind and thinking like a healthy person. That in itself made all the difference in the world. So we've got some questions that people sent in ahead of time. We'll get to those. But in John 5, there's the man who's stuck on the mat, who's been there for 38 years. And Jesus says, do you want to get well? And he says, I can't. And they call that kind of a form of learned helplessness. And I think you believe this too, that many people identify so much with their ailment, they just quit trying, quit fighting. So say a word, if you would, about our part. I mean, God does his part, but our part is really important in the healing process, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why I chose this verse, because what you've done with your faith walk and your health walk really embodies this verse. And it is on God's timing. And I've seen that people just cannot, they don't get better unless they choose that that's a path they want. Now, many people will choose that path, but it doesn't happen right away because it's on God's timing. I'm sure you would have chosen to get better in the first year. Yeah. But now what God had planned for you is so much bigger than that. And you're impacting so many because of that. And I like to share a story. In fact, it's in one of the chapters that I'm working on in the book, of one of my patients. And he's an inspiration. He's on our inspiration wall. And he came in and he had been injured in a farming accident and couldn't walk. He was paralyzed. And he came in, an elderly gentleman, he just had this will, and this, just in his eyes, you could tell he wanted to walk. And he said, I'm going to walk again. And all the doctors said he couldn't walk. He wouldn't walk. And he told me he was going to walk. So he wanted to. But when I asked him, I want you to close your eyes and picture yourself walking in your fields. Can you do it? And he closed his eyes and he tried really hard, and he started tearing up. He said, Doc, I can't see it. It's just not there. And so I said, you know what? And I've been through this many, many times. And I know if you can't even see yourself doing what you're asking me to help you do, then it's not worth our time and money and effort to do it. And so I said, tell you what, I want you to go home and I want you to work on that. And come back when you can see yourself walking. And then before they left, I pulled his wife aside and I said, this is one of those neuro tricks that we did here to help. In the beginning, I thought it was a neuro trick. Now I know it's God working through us in a different way. But I asked his wife to film one of his neighbors from the waist down walking in her husband's overalls in his fields. And I want him to watch it over and over and over again. And this is how old this was. It was on VHS tape. Do you remember those things?
Oh, that's amazing.
And so they did that faithfully, because that's something he could do. He wanted to do it. He just didn't know how. And after 3 months of watching the tape, I got a call from him, very, very excited that he could visualize in his head himself walking in his own fields. And I tell you what, I've never met anyone who works so hard to walk again. And I will say this, I'll leave the details for the book, but he did walk again in his 70s, and he worked hard at it. And people don't realize how hard he worked. And they would always question him, why are you pushing yourself so much? Why are you doing this? And only he knows his why. And he had a personal relationship with God. And he taught me many, many things early in my career about how important it was to have the patient that I'm seeing as invested as I am. And so that was very, very important. And when people identify themselves with their disease process, they're reinforcing the disease process. That's not what God wants. That's not what I want. And ultimately, it's not what serves the person. So many times we have to break through that barrier first before we start any treatment at all.
Boy, that is so good. Yeah, that was another one of those lessons that I learned, that I thought in the worst places of this relapse that I had come through, I had to keep telling myself, there's more right with me than wrong with me. I can see, I can hear, I can walk. I mean, Lord, I thank you for a colon that works. You know what I mean? I thank you or skin that works that I just started to thank him in detail for the aspects of my health that were in full working order, just to remind my soul I'm not my sickness. And maybe you need to hear that today. We're going to talk about chronic pain and inflammation. Do post your questions and I'll try to get to these. I asked for questions ahead of time, Dr. Troy, and one friend asked a question about migraines, and she said, I get migraines 2 weeks before my period. And then she takes medicine, but she ends up getting rebound migraines. Have you heard of anything like that? A migraine 2 weeks consistently before her period?
Yeah, that is almost all the time a liver issue. So the one common denominator there is that when the hormones, when they spike 2 weeks before your period, the liver has to metabolize those hormones. And then when you take medication for the migraines, medications, most of them for migraines, are metabolized in the liver. And so that is, I would almost say 100%, but I'm not going to go quite that high. So I'll say 99% of the time you're going to, once you start working on supporting the liver health, then you can actually make some changes there. So there are some very key things to do to support the liver. Number one, you want to make sure that inflammation in the body goes down, because inflammation is also processed in the liver. Inflammation usually comes from excessive exercise, which is not the most common reason why people generally have inflammation, but it's there. The foods that we eat, sugar, excess carbohydrates, too many calories, intestinal inflammation from yeast, bacteria imbalances, not going to the bathroom.
Fear.
Right? Yes. When you have fear, it basically shuts down your ability to digest properly. You go into fight or flight versus rest and digest. So you don't sleep, which is your number one anti-inflammatory mechanism God made for you.
Wow.
And you don't digest properly. And so the food sits there, the bacteria builds. And so decreasing your inflammation is crucial. Also, caffeine is broken down in the liver. Alcohol is broken down in the liver. So simply by making sure you're having bowel movements, and you referenced it early, thank you, God, for a good, healthy bowel. And remember,
I said colon, but okay.
Colon, sorry. Sorry, Doc.
Keep going.
So healthy colon, healthy bowel movements, they help get rid of our toxins. And remember that old saying, you are what you eat? That's a good saying, but the truth is you are what you don't eliminate. Mm-hmm. And so that's when you start to get into trouble, because those things start to recycle and the liver ends up getting it again. Wow. So you're causing more work for the liver. For example, women in particular who don't go to the bathroom 1 to 3 times a day will end up recycling estrogen. And estrogen is broken down in the liver. Wow. And so a lot of women pre-menopause will start to get hot flashes before they're even into menopause, simply because they're recycling the estrogen, or they get estrogen dominance, which causes weight gain around the hips. So, which I've heard is an important thing for women. I'm just.
Exactly. You don't love that. Yeah. Well, let's talk, if we can, about more about inflammation, because when your body's in inflammation, you're really in a vulnerable place for other diseases. And so it seems like it can be a vicious cycle that chronic illness can cause inflammation. But if we contribute to our inflammation, we make ourselves susceptible to disease, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. It feeds on itself that way. So inflammation will, number one, when you are in an inflamed state, your hormones work at 50% efficiency. Wow. So even though your labs might be normal, if you have normal thyroid hormone and you're inflamed, they may be working at a lesser rate, which then means you have the symptoms of hypothyroid, but you go with a doctor and they say your labs are fine, you're okay. And you're like, no, doc, I don't feel good. And it's because of the inflammation. Mm-hmm. Inflammation also will affect our nerves and how quickly they transmit information. In the beginning, it actually causes them to increase the rate. So we actually see this almost hyper response to our nerves. If the nerves sense pain, that's not good. Our pain goes up. So that's why inflammation causes pain. But over time, inflammation starts to cause the nerves to become almost dead. And it's like the crying wolf scenario. And we end up seeing a down regulation of all of our neurologic function. Dr. Perlmutter, a medical doctor down in Florida, wrote a great book called Grain Brain, where he talks about the inflammation that occurs in our brain and the consequences of inflammation affecting our brain. And so we see this spike in the beginning neurologically and then a down regulation. The other thing is, in acidity and inflammatory bodies, we see all of our enzymes work at 50% efficiency. So enzymes help break things down and clean things up and transfer one particle into another. So there's another use for it in the body. When we lose that function, on top of losing hormones, that's when we start to see the body work less and less efficiently.
Wow. Okay, for those of you who just hopped on, I'm Susie Larson talking to Dr. Troy Spurrill. He's CEO, founder of Synapse Center for Health and Healing, located in Eagan, Minnesota. And he's got people coming from all over the nation to see him. And again, I think he's brilliant, and the people that he's helped has been amazing. I'm going to try to get some of these questions here. Deb Brees says this: would a ketogenic diet help with my diverticulitis? I'm at the end of a flare now, is hospitalized with IV antibiotics. What do you say, Doc?
Well, actually, it could. We've seen people start with ketogenic, and the reality is you have to pay attention to how your body reacts. Now, with diverticulitis, there's a pocket issue as far as pockets forming in the intestines. So, what really matters is to reduce stress overall, so you're into that fight or flight mode. So, when it comes to diverticulitis, we first start with reducing stress or improving sleep and working on digestive enzymes. So when you get your brain firing to the digestive system better, then you produce more enzymes. So first and foremost, that's what's needed with diverticulitis. Now, there are a couple different diets that can help with that, but you want to make sure you break down your food really, really well. So take your time eating, digest the food thoroughly. If you get lab tests and your total protein on the lab test is low or too high, meaning below 6.9 and above 7.6, then that's going to indicate you're not digesting your protein all that well, and you probably need betaine hydrochloric acid until you can start to work on the real problem, which is the brain's not regulating things properly. The other thing is the digestive enzymes, just breaking things down properly and balancing the good and bad bacteria. Now, the people who are addicted to sugar or have had high inflammatory sugar diets will do well with ketogenic, and then slowly go over to more of a plant-based diet, which is funny because it's the exact opposite diet. Wow. So it's all about balance, but ketogenic will help in the beginning for most people if you take care of the stress component and breaking down the actual food properly with proper hydrochloric acid and digestive enzymes.
Okay, so talk about the gut-brain connection. I wasn't at Harvard Medical School that said that they could easily be considered one organ because there's such a connection. And so many people, Dr. Troy, deal with gut issues, whether it's SIBO, candida, irritable bowel, and some of them may not even know what's wrong with their gut. So talk about the importance of gut health and then the connection between the gut and the brain.
Yeah, there's quite a big connection because they call the gut the second brain, and it's because of how connected it is. And it started way back when, and there was a great book probably 25 years ago called Molecules of Emotions by Candace Pert. She was a female scientist in a traditionally male-dominated arena. She really did something quite miraculous, and she should have won a Nobel Prize, but she hasn't yet. But she wrote the book Molecules of Emotion, and what she found is she isolated these neuropeptides, these protein sequences that were found in the brain, and then looked for receptors everywhere in the body to see where do our emotions end up. And what she found was the majority of these receptors were in the lining of the digestive tract. It wasn't even close. And so what we now know is that a lot of our emotional well-being does actually start with the gut and the brain and how they connect. And I know it's an oversimplification, but when we're in fight or flight, we're not in rest and digest. And so I could open up a clinic and just do one thing, teaching people how to rest and digest properly. And I'll be full for the rest of my life as far as patients.
Because we live in fight flight as a culture? Is that what you mean?
As a society, we do right now. Back in the day, it used to be when our life was in danger, when we were being chased by an animal or we were fighting to defend our family. And now it's turned into when I read a bad tweet or when I don't get the text message that I wanted.
So in some ways, it's a self-induced fight flight, isn't it? I mean, because we're choosing to, it kind of goes back to the verse that you opened with, come away and, rest a while and learn the unforced rhythms of grace. That's something we have to learn. We stay in fight flight. What I remember, and tell me if I remember this wrong, but as you taught me, you go to fight flight, your cells go into self-protection. So even if you're drinking water, you're not getting hydrated like you could. Even if you're eating well, you're not getting the benefits if you're doing that, but living in fight flight, right?
That's exactly right. The cells will fold over and the receptors that are on the cells get covered up. So now the minerals can't bind to the receptors and the water can't go into the cell. Wow. So we can actually see people age from stress. And so we see a lot more of that. And we that's one of the reasons you mentioned earlier how much of how important it is for me with my faith and science. It's because the more I learn about how the body works and then I read scripture, I see the brilliance of it. And I go through all these it takes me a year to learn about fight or flight and what happens in the cell. And then I find out the answer is to get into rest and digest. And I read scripture and it says, be still, rest in me.
Yeah. In
five words, God basically does what I'm trying to do for a living. He tells us.
Wow.
He answers it for us.
So
we need that message.
I was going to say, what have you seen with your patients who come in and live in fight flight? I was one of those patients when I saw you a couple and a half years ago, and my life has radically changed as I learned the unforced rhythms of grace. But talk about some of the changes you've seen in people who've come in as a habit, live in fight flight. What are the changes in their health as they learn the unforced rhythms of grace, learned how to get into rest and digest, where they're tasting their food and stewarding their story in a way that's life-giving?
That's a great question, because when people come in, what I've seen is sometimes they come in and even though, actually you're a perfect example of this, even though they've been suffering from something, you had a go after it attitude. I'm going to conquer this, which is noble and it's very helpful for me. But what did I have to do with you? I had to say, we need to slow you down. We need you to stop for a little bit. And I will say a lot of my chronic Lyme sufferers, the biggest challenge they have is learning when not to detox, when learning not to go after the Lyme. Because you have to have your adrenals and your stress response in a certain place in order for you to then overcome what you're up against. So if you're in a battle, picture a battlefield, you can't be fighting all the time. You've got to retreat a little bit, regroup. And so many of my patients who come in with the fighting attitude of I'm going to take this over, I actually have to tell them to reel it in a little bit. We need to recuperate first, then we're going to go after it. And we are going to go after it. Don't worry about it. Yeah. But you can't do that if you're not set up for that. And so many people, that's really what they're looking for, or what they need is to just recover. And I want them to hear this. I want everyone who's suffering right now, it's okay for you to take a break from the healing process, from the conscious healing process. Let the innate healing that God put in you take over at certain times. If we're constantly working on our health, it becomes our new job and our new stressor. And so it's very important, and this is weird coming from a health guy, but this is what I've seen. You have to take a break from it sometimes. And with that, that means recovering, recouping who you are, getting your reserves built up, and then going after it again. And when we see that occur, we see greater gains. Yeah. Now, the flip side of that are the people who don't come in with that attitude, and they just need more support with their immune system, and they need to be pushed. And that's actually the majority of people, where we have to walk them through, because they'll stop at the second they start to feel uncomfortable. And the reality is, sometimes there's uncomfortable that's good, and sometimes there's uncomfortable that's bad. And so it's really important to be able to have that discernment. And I tell you what, the body gives us clues, and when you can pay attention to those clues and learn from it, it helps with the discernment.
Boy, that's so good. Number of people have chronic Lyme that are checking in today. What have you learned about Lyme? What do you know about Lyme now that you didn't know years ago?
Well, a lot. I tell you what, in the last 5 years, we've learned more. The professionals have learned more. My frustration as a medical professional or healthcare professional was that there was no way to measure it effectively. Therefore, it got dismissed easily. And people would come in suffering and say, I don't know what's wrong, doc. I don't know what's wrong. And I could, assessing the body, I could tell something was wrong, but I didn't know what it was, because I would send them for a Lyme test that I thought was accurate, and it ended up coming back negative. So I'm like, well, it's not that, let's look elsewhere. And the reality was, it was the testing that was at fault, not what the people were saying. And so I've seen over the years, in the last 5 years, we've had major breakthroughs. And I'll tell you what, I think it's because of the Lyme's groups that are out there, the Lyme's patients getting together, talking, and doctors doing the same thing. There are doctors who are talking about what are you seeing, and when they start sharing that information, and when patients start sharing information, all of a sudden we started to see that, you know what, this is a real thing. Yeah. And we just don't have the technology to measure it yet. So I tell my Lyme's patients that are suffering, when we finally are able to diagnose it, I tell them, think about back in the early 1700s, when people would get colds or the flu. Microbiology had not been invented yet. Louis Pasteur invented it with the microscope. Up until then, you couldn't see it. They used to call it the ether, or something is in the air. And so that's our current day's Lyme right now, where just because we can't measure it, because we can't see it like we should, doctors will dismiss it, but it's a real thing. So we're getting closer and closer at being able to find it and discover it. And now we've got enough information to know that Lyme's and mycotoxins is measured in different ways. And we have some very courageous doctors around the country that are pioneering research right now, and courageous patients that are sharing their testimonials and learning. I learn as much from my Lyme's patients as I do from the Lyme professionals around the country. And as we get better at discerning what's true Lyme's and what might be something else sneaking in there that mimics Lyme's, we'll start to make some actual progress here in the upcoming years. But the one thing I've learned, the most important thing I've learned with Lyme's, is exactly what we talked about. If your adrenals and your stress are not in check, you will not make gains long-term with Lyme's. And so it's the same thing is true for mold toxicity. Number one, you've got to remove yourself from the environment of mold exposure, but mold and Lyme's mimic each other. And once you've had one, you're more susceptible to the other, much more susceptible. I didn't know that even 2 years ago. And so we're learning a lot, us docs. And so, and you know this, you've opened up my eyes to a lot of other things as well. You give me a lot of credit that I willingly pass on to God. But at the same time, I don't think people really realize how much authentic feedback from people who are going through the suffering helps us figure out what's really, truly going on.
Yeah, and I haven't said this publicly, but, I was diagnosed, well, this part I've said publicly, but I was diagnosed with Lyme 28 years ago, back when they knew so little about it. Well, the relapse that I had 3 years ago looked like Lyme's, act like Lyme's, felt like Lyme. And through you and another doctor, a fellow friend and colleague of yours and ours, found out I had mold toxicity. In fact, I've done a lot of reading about it. And they say many, I think this is true, but at least some with chronic Lyme turn out to have some kind of mold toxicity in their body, biotoxins, mycotoxins. Is that something that you've found True.
Yes, for sure. They're very, very similar as far as how they affect our immune system. And then once you have an impacted immune system in the brain and in the body, there are consequences to that. To our ability to manage inflammation is the biggest one. So, for example, we talked about inflammation earlier. If your brain is regulating inflammation properly, then it's only going to be inflammatory foods like sugar and things like that that will truly get to you. However, if you've been compromised with Lyme or mold, all of a sudden the area of the brain that regulates inflammation is not in charge as much. And it takes one little extra insult to your body, whether it be just going for a little run or not sleeping properly, and all of a sudden you have all this inflammatory stuff. And it's because these other hormones and these proteins get downregulated in the brain, and we become more sensitive to our environment. Almost everyone with multiple chemical sensitivity will have the exact same symptoms as Lyme and mold, and you have to treat it the same way. You have to fix the brain barrier, the gut barrier, and you have to start to balance the inflammatory interactions that are occurring in the brain and the body.
Wow, absolutely amazing. Okay, here. Let me see if I can scroll down a little bit. We believe that my husband has gadolinium toxicity from many, many MRIs with contrast. Is there a test for this? Is there a way to get it flushed from the body? That's Cindy Sternberg Key. Do you need me to read that again, or did you catch that?
No, I got it. So with gadolinium, there's a way to test it. You can actually go through a lab and you want to do a doctor's data is the lab. You have to go through a doctor who uses doctor's data or a lab similar. And you want to actually use a chelating agent. So the most common ones are DMSA and EDTA for gadolinium, and do a heavy metal urine test. Now, if you do a heavy metal urine test, that'll pull the gadolinium out of the body, and you'll be able to measure it. However, EDTA prefers lead over gadolinium. DMSA prefers mercury over gadolinium. So if you do the test and your lead and mercury are high and gadolinium doesn't show up, it doesn't mean you have gadolinium toxicity. These chelating agents will bind to the first thing available. So it's one of those scenarios where you have to do the urine test, and it's a provocative challenge, it's called, or provoking agent of DMSA or EDTA, and that will tell you if you have heavy metal toxicity. You have to repeat that test to make sure you're making progress. The other thing is, and the doctor who's doing it will be able to help facilitate this, but you have to make sure the kidneys are healthy enough to pull it out of the body. So unlike the liver, a little bit will go through the liver, most of it's through the kidneys. And so you can't do it very, very quickly. It has to be slow and methodical. A lot of times in our heavy metal cleanses, we'll do 4 days on, 10 days off, because during the 10 days, you have to allow the kidneys to repair and heal. And then you also have to rebuild up the glutathione that's occurring intracellularly. And so there's certain nutrition you take during those 10 days off, and then the 4 days you go after the heavy metals. So it's actually pretty common, especially more nowadays with all the different testing that is being done, that we're seeing gadolinium.
You know, over a decade ago, I got an infrared sauna in my home to manage joint pain. What I learned through the mold toxicity battle in the last few years is how amazing it is for detoxing. Would that be okay for her husband as well? Would that be a good thing, infrared sauna, or is that a totally different conversation?
No, that's a good part of the process, is a good tool in the toolbox. If hydration levels are optimal, then it's great. If hydration levels are not there, then I don't generally recommend it. And it depends on the lymph flow as well.
All right. Number of questions about probiotic. So much controversy around them. Is there one that you like best? What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm not sure if there's controversy in my world. It's not controversial, but I've seen.
They're not all the same, though, right?
No, they're not all the same. There's a lot of different. I guess the controversy is that there's different strains and they do different things, and they're supposed to be in different areas of the body. So we're learning a lot about that. So the controversy is it's just not a one probiotic fix-all type scenario. I like to get probiotics from food first and foremost. So that's live food, live fermentation. So you should always start with that. There are multiple different companies that I'll use for actual probiotics just to switch it up because they use different strains. I like that companies are starting to actually track which strain they're using now. And in 10 years, we'll know more as far as science, as far as specifics. But I tell you what, probiotics that's like trying to assess the stars. There's trillions of stars and there's so many variables. And this is what instead of diving deep into that, because you could do just on the current research, you could do a 1-week seminar on the different types of probiotics and not even touch the research and what they potentially do or what they do. This is my general rule of thumb. If God made it, it's good. If man changed it, beware. And when you pay attention to that rule, then it allows you to just trust that God designed us properly. And having fermented foods is a part of that process. So when you take a probiotic, you're taking a piece of what God designed for us. Now, in today's age, that can be good to offset a couple different scenarios as far as imbalances. So you can start to swing that pendulum back the other way. So it can be very, very good. So right now, at this stage of the game, probiotics are good with a few exceptions. Sometimes when someone's been diagnosed with SIBO, which stands for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. I see the aha, I see the finger.
I know this.
Yeah. You can take the last half of this one if you want. But when you have SIBO, that's the good bacteria growing in the wrong location, and you don't necessarily want to feed that. So again, if your stomach acid is too low and the pH of your small intestine starts to change, then you want to hold off on the probiotics. And that might be where people are seeing the controversy stuff. But for me, if you find that the stomach pH is not a problem, then probiotics are generally good. Just have to mix it up.
Do you have a couple of, I know you do, but a couple of brands that you like, a probiotic? Or any?
Yeah. So yeah, I'll use right now at the clinic. I use about 5 or 6 different companies. So USANA Health Sciences, Metagenics, Nutrition Dynamics, Zymogen. There are a couple other pure encapsulations as well. So there are different variations of probiotics that I found helpful, and we'll use different companies. So just make sure, if you can, read the label and make sure that they test for the live strains, not when they're produced, but when they've been shipped. So, for example, the USANA Health Sciences company, they did testing to make sure that the bacteria, the probiotics, were alive when they sat on the shelf for the customer after 30 days. That's a big difference.
Yeah.
If they're alive when they put them into the capsule, that's good, but they need to be alive 30 days later when we're ingesting them.
Very good. What are the symptoms and the implications of leaky gut? What is leaky gut?
Well, the symptoms can be all over the place. So leaky gut basically is, if you think of your digestive system as a tube, the small intestine going down. By the way, Susie, I like having video because I get to use my hands. I think at some point I must have been Italian or something, but I get to show people what the digestive system would look like.
First of all, make no mistake, when we do in-studio interviews on radio, we still do that with our hands.
Yeah, but people can see me now. So what was the question? No, I'm just joking. I've got it.
Fantastic.
So we've got leaky gut. We've got this long tube, and there's little holes that are there that aren't supposed to be there. So when that happens, we start to absorb things that shouldn't be absorbed. Now, depending on what we absorb, our immune system, which is our defense system, it's basically supposed to attack anything it doesn't recognize. Foreign invaders, bacteria, viruses, or something that looks different than what it's used to. So what happens is, in the beginning, the immune system will attack the unbroken down food particles. that are now coming in, or bacteria that normally is pushed out or kept away because it's bad bacteria. So our immune system starts to react to that. Now, depending on what it attacks, will actually cause different reactions within the body. And here's where it gets kind of cool, kind of interesting too. There's some links when you break it down to the amino acid sequence or the genetic sequence of the foods. You can start to see that there's a bit of a connection between dairy and certain heart disease and diabetes, type 1 diabetes, autoimmune diabetes. So the leaky gut many times will trigger autoimmunity. There's also a link between some people with wheat and celiac and how it can affect our dopamine levels, which can be depression and inflammatory disorders, and just that feeling of not having that pleasure in our life. So we start to see different realities based on what is actually sneaking through there and what our immune system actually attacks or identifies as a foreign invader. For autoimmune disease that's viral related, it can be anything from scleroderma and skin issues, tightening of the skin and discoloration of the skin. But if it's dairy, it could be heart or diabetes that comes up, and especially thin person diabetes. So we see all kinds of different variables. The one thing that we do start to see is when there's a breakdown there of the lining with leaky gut, that is a problem with the digestive system, which will send a signal back to the brain. So if there's a problem there, if there's a breakdown, the brain's going to become aware of it. And so what does that do? It creates a fight or flight response, which further actually shuts down the digestive system and the sleep system. So chronic fatigue is one of the first symptoms we see with leaky gut. The crazy thing is, in the beginning, people who have the fight or flight response may have adrenaline release, so their energy will actually go up. And so they may have hyper energy for years with an autoimmune disorder and not even know they have it.
And then they crash?
And then they crash eventually, yeah. Mm-hmm. But it could be anywhere from months to 10, 15 years later. If they're good at managing their fight or flight and living in the adrenaline mode, they could manage that. And I do know people who do that. They've done that for 10, 15 years where they manage that fight or flight. We call them type A personalities, but some people are born that way, and some people have leaky gut and have developed it too.
But they're not doing it without consequence, right? I mean, I've met plenty of people where they almost pride themselves on driving, only need 2-3 hours to sleep. They're not doing that without consequence, right?
That's correct. There will be a fall eventually, and so there is a downward turn that does happen, and so it's very important to recognize where your energy is coming from. And so adrenal fatigue that starts with leaky gut and adrenaline, hyperadrenaline, that's false energy. That's not real energy. And real energy basically will lift you up and keep you going forever. And adrenaline will eventually fade.
Wow. Let's talk for a moment. I want to reset for those of you who just hopped on. I'm Susie Larson, talking to our good friend, Dr. Troy Spurrill. He, again, is the founder and the CEO of Synapse Center for Health and Healing that's located in Eagan, Minnesota. And I want you to know, too, we're going to be giving away 5 copies of this book, In Over Your Head. It's on physical and spiritual health. I'll tell you how to get a copy in just a little bit here. But I want to talk about gluten, because that's the big fad in some ways. I mean, I've been gluten intolerant for 15 years. But my husband, who's a big man, 6'3", he just gave it up just as a fast, wanted to fast for our family. And he lost 30 pounds in about 5-6 weeks. And he had clarity in his brain. I didn't even know I was foggy in my brain. I didn't know I was lethargic, because he's a driver. He's a type A, so he just would push through it. Yeah. But it's something lifted for him. Why is that? And is that the case for everybody?
Well, no, it's not the case for everybody. But I would probably say the majority of people, if they gave up gluten, would be more clear-headed, the majority of people. Now, gluten is a very heavy protein in grains. And I will say this, I'll go back to my original quote. If God made it, it's good. if man changed it, beware. And I will say we've changed gluten in the United States. And so I have many people who are very gluten sensitive who travel to Europe, and they're using the old grains, and farming practices are a little older than what we've done here, and they can tolerate it. Not everyone, but a small percentage can go over there. And so that tells me a little something about how we've changed our food and how it's meant to be delivered to us. And that has consequences. And so I encourage people to just try it. Go 30 days gluten-free and just assess, do I feel better or do I feel worse? If you lose 30 pounds just by giving up gluten, it's from one of two reasons. You're either having some level of mild inflammatory reaction to gluten, or gluten is a part of carbohydrates and it's just reduced your carbohydrate load. And by consuming less carbohydrates, you've lost weight. But the clear brain with that tells us that there's a small level. Now, I think your husband, he fits in the majority of the conversation as far as the people affected that have a slight or mild impact from an inflammatory food. Sugar is one, gluten is another one. So I've had people, though, give up gluten and no consequences, no changes.
Wow, interesting.
So it's not across the board, but it's something that is on the conversation on par with sugar as far as really making sure that things are kept in balance.
Well, we could do a whole show on the sugar thing. And I remember once when you were on the show, and I don't remember if you were telling me this during your break or if we talked about it on the show, but we've talked about the impact of sugar and inflammation, and we really need to delve into that more, I think, one of these days. But you talked about these two scenarios. One was a young guy in his 40s who got, I think, rear-ended, and his whole body went into just spasm, and it took him forever to recover because he'd been living on the edge, drinking the big gulps and eating sweet rolls and just sugar, monster drinks and whatever. And then you talked about this couple, and I think you said they were in their 70s or 80s, who were in a much worse accident. And they basically walked away from that because of clean living up to that point. And I feel like these two scenarios speak volumes, because there's times we live like, it's not bugging me now, so it's not going to bug me. But these are all invisible changes. And your old couple, they were stewarding their health. So when the trauma came, they walked through it. And I think, Dr. Troy, there are spiritual implications to this as well. I mean, we could, again, stretch this analogy, because it's like how you steward your faith, how you steward your health, your everything. When the crisis comes, determines how you fare through it all. So that's a mouthful, but speak to those scenarios and what we can learn.
Well, yeah, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head with what I've seen. Well, first of all, the story is right, where the elderly couple, and they were in their 80s, their early 80s, and they survived a head-on crash, 70 miles an hour. Wow. And basically, with a week or two of assessing and treatment, they were good. And so how that impacts our health and our relationships and our spirituality is very important. I want to say it in a different way. When we're inflamed, so what you just mentioned with Kevin, with him giving up gluten, he actually felt more clear-headed. What I will say is this: people who are really inflamed and don't know it because it's happened so slowly through their life, or they're hurting because of their poor health or disease, it influences their mood. It influences their level of joy in life, which also impacts their relationships with the people around them. And many of the people listening will know when something's out of balance chemically, inflammation, hormones, then we can react to the people we love the most, and we're not the best of who we are. Now, I want you to take that relationship, and I want you to now say, how is your relationship with God when you're inflamed? It's no different. How we treat the people we love when we're inflamed is the same as how we treat God when we're inflamed. When we don't take care of our health, it is a potential disconnect from God. And that's one of the things I want to really talk to people about, that just because we're living in a fix it now, very quick fix society, or live on the edge, and we just push the limits with stress and everything. And what it's doing is pushing people away from God. And there's a lot of answers. All our answers are in God, and he will work through people, and he cannot work through you as well when you're disconnected from him. So for me, it's a pretty big, significant deal to keep your health as good as possible. This is our temple, and God designed it that way. And when we're in alignment with that, we just can connect better. Now, that's not saying that if you're suffering from a chronic disease that you can't connect with God. But what I am saying is that there are many people walking around inflamed, and it's affecting their relationships. They're not as good husbands, they're not as good wives, and they're not as good stewards when you're inflamed or diseased. And it happens so slowly with simple little choices like, oh, it's just a donut. Oh, it's National Donut Day. It's National Snickers Day, or whatever it is. There's a National Day for everything now. Whatever happened to National Carrot Day? That's the one I want.
That'll be a hit, but I agree with you. But you think about, this applies across the board. Think about the marriage that actually is neglected. The crisis happens, the marriage explodes. You think about the health, where you live on the edge forever. The accident happens and you take forever to recover. It applies in every way. It all goes back to stewardship. And as you said, those of us who struggle with chronic illnesses, yes, God is very near, but there's so much that we do to either contribute to our health and healing or to the lack thereof. And this isn't legalism. This is just passion, isn't it? For us to say steward. And so stewarding your health might look like developing a consistent bedtime. And we've got about 9 minutes left. Let's just talk about what healthy stewardship might look like for those to just make some next steps for healthy stewardship. So the way that you show up in life, at work, with your family and loved ones, you're bringing your best self and you'll feel good. So talk a bit about just some basic healthy stewardship.
Yeah, the stewardships are really there to build your reserve. So you may not be able to feel it right away, but they'll be there when you need it. Mm-hmm. And so it's a delayed gratification, much like what God was promising in our opening statement there, as far as I'll show you how to take a real rest. Just imagine what that feels like, a real rest. And so delayed gratification is a part of the journey, a part of the walk. And so little small choices, it's what you do when no one else is looking that matters. Going to bed at an early time or a consistent time, getting quality sleep, getting up and moving. So motion is life. We need a certain amount of exercise and movement in our life to keep our brain alive. When we sit and we think too much, that's detrimental. We can't sit and think too much. We do want to take time to rest, but we need to move at the same time. So we need both in our life. And a little bit of stress is good. And a little bit of joy is really good. And so what I would say is, number one, especially in North America, and I get the privilege of speaking with people from Australia and Europe and Africa, and just had a patient from Japan, and this is the same around the world. It's important to take time for yourself when it comes to identifying your stressors in your life and talking with people. So with women, it's important that you talk about it. With guys, it's important that you work it out and at least come to a conclusion. Guys don't need to talk about it as much as they need to do something physical to overcome it. Very, very different scenarios. Number two, our diets are more important than people give them credit for. We need to make sure what we put in our mouth and in our mind is good for us. And if you're not sure if it's good for you, what goes in our mind, scripture is a great lesson all the time. Self-condemning thoughts are not good. When you are beating yourself up, it's not good. One of the things I'll say, I have the most caring people who come before me suffering, and they don't really get it until I say, let's pretend, I want you as a 45-year-old woman to picture yourself as a 10-year-old girl sitting in the corner over there crying. Now, would you go over and kick her while she's crying and down? And she says, goodness, no. And I have to point out, then why are you doing that now to yourself at 45? And we do that all the time. We beat ourselves up. We look in the mirror and we pick apart the 2 or 3 little things that aren't perfect. We look at our diet even, as I'm saying this, and say, this isn't perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's just a process. The scenario is when we can get to a lifestyle where you can say, I can do this the rest of my life. That's when we know you're there. And that's the entire goal. I just want you to get to the point where you can say, I can do this the rest of my life, and it's healthy for you and it's working for you. It doesn't have to be perfect. One of the funny things that ends up happening is that you end up cleaning it up from where you think you're going to get, and it just gets a little bit cleaner and a little bit cleaner. So it's baby steps. So get good sleep, good quality sleep. And if it's not, then work on it. If you're not remembering your dreams, there's a problem. If you could take a nap 3 hours after getting up, there's a problem. If you have fat that is accumulating on your knees or in your calves, there's a problem with sleep. If you are not able to get through an entire day with full energy, there's a problem. If you have that afternoon lull where you need a nap every single day, that's a problem. If you need a nap because you didn't get sleep the night before because the baby was up, that's a different story. And then what we put in our mind and our mouth, and then what we eliminate. Make sure your bowels are moving. I know as we don't really appreciate this until we get older, but what you eliminate really, really matters. And if you want to see how important it is, I want you to go to a senior living center near you and listen to them as they're playing cards. And I want you to count how many times they talk about bowel movements.
We can learn a lot from the elderly.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. Well, I pray, friends, that you enjoyed this. Hope and pray and we want to hear anxiety, worries, some of those things. But I want to hear from you too, if you've got topics that you want us to address. And I mentioned this book, Over Your Head. This book is on physical and spiritual health. And the way that I want you to be able to get a copy is you can hop on my website, SusieLarson.com, and just talk about what you got out of Dr. Troy's words and wisdom tonight. What was a standout for you? Don't forget your mailing address. We will pick 5 names and we'll get the book out in the mail. But also, I want to know questions for next month for Dr. Troy and what just stood out to you. It would be great. SusieLarson.com. Dr. Troy, this worked. I'm so grateful because we've been missing being on the air. I've been hearing from our listeners going, when are you two back on the air? So this has been great. I want to thank you. Anything else? Where can people find you in your clinic on the web? How about that?
You can go to officialsynapse.com and our website will be there, and we will have information on different topics that come up all the time. Okay.
Officialsynapse.com. Officialsynapse.com. Well, Dr. Troy, this has been fantastic, and I just bless you, and I thank you so much for the time.
Thanks for having me, Susie. Always a pleasure.
Yep. Until next time, hop on SusieLarson.com. Let us know what you thought of tonight's broadcast. If you have questions for Dr. Troy next month, we want to hear them. What was your takeaway? What was the standout point for you? Remember your mailing address, and 5 of you will get a copy of the book In Over Your Head. God bless you, and we'll meet you back here next time.